Imagine holding a piece of pottery in your hand. It looks ordinary, perhaps a share from a water jug or a storage jar. But when you look closer, you notice something impossible. The surface hasn't just been broken, it has been melted. One side is fused into a bubbly greenish glass. To achieve this state, this piece of clay had to be exposed to temperatures exceeding 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hotter than a volcano. It is hotter than the surface of the sun during a solar flare. It is hot enough to boil titanium. Here is the problem. This shard was found in the ruins of a city that existed in the Bronze Age. The technology to generate that kind of heat wouldn't be invented for another 4,000 years. For decades, archaeologists looked at these ruins near the Dead Sea and couldn't explain what they were seeing. There was no sign of a military siege, no arrowheads, no battering rams. Just a sudden violent interruption that turned a thriving civilization into ash. But when they stopped looking at the ground like historians and started looking at it like forensic scientists, the terrifying truth emerged. We aren't looking at a war zone, we are looking at a crime scene where the weapon came from outer space. And the witnesses to this event didn't write a police report, they wrote the book of Genesis. By the end of this video, you are going to understand that the stories we dismiss as myths, Sodom and Gomorrah, Noah's flood, Atlantis, aren't fairy tales. They are data. They are desperate warnings encoded by survivors who watched their worlds end and wanted to make sure we didn't forget. Science is finally catching up to Scripture. And what we are finding in the soil, the seafloor, and the ice cores confirms our worst fears. The ancients weren't imagining the apocalypse, they survived it. But before we look at the water that swallowed the world, we have to go back to the fire that fell from the sky. In the Jordan Valley, northeast of the Dead Sea, lies a massive mound known as el-Hammam. Today, it's a dusty, barren landscape. But 3,500 years ago, this was a paradise. It was a massive, fortified city-state, significantly larger than Jerusalem or Jericho. It was the Manhattan of the Bronze Age Levant, a center of trade, agriculture, and power. For centuries, life here was predictable. The sun rose, crops grew, and the city walls offered protection. Until one day, around 1650 BCE, the sky simply ignited. Excavators at the site have uncovered a layer of destruction that defies conventional explanation. They call it the destruction matrix. It is a 5-foot-thick blanket of carbonized ash, pulverized mud brick, and melted debris. When you walk through a normal ancient ruin, you find walls that have crumbled over time. At Tal el-Hammam, the walls weren't just knocked down. They were sheared off. The foundations show that the buildings were sliced near the ground level by a directional force that was moving faster than the speed of sound. But the most disturbing evidence is microscopic. Buried in the soil, scientists found shocked quartz. These are sand grains that have been cracked internally by immense, sudden pressure. This doesn't happen in a house fire. It doesn't happen in an earthquake. In nature, shocked quartz only forms during a cosmic impact or a nuclear detonation. They also found spherules of rare metals, iridium and platinum, sprinkled across the site like cosmic dust. These elements are common in asteroids but incredibly rare in the Earth's crust. So, what happened? Based on the forensic evidence, a team of researchers published a groundbreaking study in Scientific Reports that paints a horrifying picture of that day. They believe a space rock, perhaps an asteroid or comet about 160 feet wide, entered the Earth's atmosphere at 38,000 miles per hour. It didn't hit the ground. If it had, there would be a crater. Instead, the pressure of the atmosphere caused it to explode about 2.5 miles above the city. This is known as a cosmic airburst. It's the same phenomenon that happened over Tunguska, Siberia in 1908, but this one was far, far more powerful. The energy released was equivalent to 1,000 Hiroshima bombs detonating simultaneously. The first thing the people of Tal el-Hammam would have experienced was the light. A flash so bright it would have instantly blinded anyone looking at the sky. Then came the heat. A thermal pulse of over 3,000 degrees slammed into the city. In a fraction of a second, pottery melted into glass. Mud bricks, the very building blocks of their homes, didn't just burn. They boiled and burst into vapor. Clothing, wood, and bodies would have been incinerated instantly. Seconds later, the shockwave arrived. A wall of air moving at supersonic speeds smashed into the city, leveling the palace, the temples, and the defensive walls. A 900-pound stone mill used for grinding grain was lifted by the wind and hurled through the air like a frisbee. In the blink of an eye, the city was erased. But the devastation didn't stop at the city gates. The explosion was so intense that it vaporized the water in the nearby Dead Sea. A toxic brine of superheated salt was blasted into the atmosphere and then rained down on the entire valley. The fertile soil, which had supported human life for thousands of years, was instantly poisoned. The salt rendered the land completely dead. Agriculture collapsed. Over 100 smaller villages in a 15-mile radius were abandoned. The region remained a desolate wasteland for the next 600 years. Now, pause for a moment. Forget the science and think about the story. A thriving city, a sudden catastrophe, fire and brimstone raining from the heavens. The city consumed, the land turned to salt. This is exactly the story of Sodom and Gomorrah found in the book of Genesis. For centuries, scholars treated the biblical account as a moral allegory or a myth. But the details align too perfectly with the physical evidence to be a coincidence. The Bible describes smoke rising like a furnace. The archaeology shows a destruction layer caused by heat hotter than a volcano. The Bible describes the area being turned into a salt wasteland. The geology confirms that hypersaline soil poisoned the agriculture for centuries. Even the story of Lot's wife looking back and turning into a pillar of salt takes on a new, gruesome reality. In a superheated airburst, bodies are indeed calcified and encased in debris instantly. What we are likely seeing here is the transition of trauma into text. An oral tradition passed down by the few survivors in the surrounding hills, telling the story of the day God wiped a city off the face of the map. They didn't have the words for cosmic airburst or thermal radiation, so they used the only language they had. They called it judgment. But here is the chilling part. This wasn't the only time humanity had to find a divine explanation for a geological nightmare. While fire destroyed the valley, water was waiting to devour the world. And the story of the Great Flood might not be about rain at all. It might be about the ocean breaking through a wall. The wall of water and the beast beneath. But apocalypse doesn't always fall from the sky. Sometimes it arrives from the horizon. Quiet at first until the ocean itself decides to move. For thousands of years, cultures across the entire globe, from the Sumerians in Mesopotamia to the Maya in Mesoamerica, have shared the exact same nightmare, the story of a world-ending flood. The Bible speaks of Noah and 40 days of rain. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written centuries earlier, tells of Utnapishtim building a boat to survive a deluge sent by angry gods. Skeptics have long argued that these are just metaphors for local river floods, but geology suggests something far more terrifying. The story of the flood might not be about rain at all. It might be a memory of the day the Mediterranean Sea broke through a dam and swallowed a continent. Rewind 7,500 years. The Earth was warming, the Ice Age was ending, and sea levels were rising globally. At that time, what we now call the Black Sea was actually a giant freshwater lake. It was smaller, lower, and completely isolated from the world's oceans. Its shores were lush, fertile, and densely populated by early farming communities who thrived on the fresh water. To the south, the Mediterranean Sea was rising, pushing against a natural land bridge at the Bosphorus Strait in modern-day Turkey. For centuries, the rock held, and then it failed. According to the Black Sea deluge hypothesis, first proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, the breach was catastrophic. When the natural dam collapsed, salt water from the Mediterranean surged into the Black Sea basin with a force estimated to be 200 times greater than Niagara Falls. It wasn't a slow creep, it was a roar. The water poured in at a rate of 10 cubic miles per day. If you were standing on the shore of that freshwater lake, you wouldn't have seen rain. You would have heard a thunderous roar growing louder by the hour, and then you would have seen the water rise, not inches per day, but feet per hour. The flood carved a channel 300 feet deep through the bedrock. It swallowed fertile farmland at a pace of a mile a day. Villages, homes, and entire ecosystems were submerged so quickly that people likely had to run for their lives, abandoning everything behind. The evidence for this isn't just a theory. It is buried in the mud. In the late 1990s, when researchers took sediment cores from the bottom of the Black Sea, they found something that shouldn't be there. Deep beneath the layers of marine mud, they found the bleached shells of freshwater snails. And right at the boundary line between the freshwater and the salt water, the carbon dating tells a consistent story. The change happened abruptly, roughly 7,500 years ago. Now think about the human cost. Tens of thousands of people were displaced. They fled north into Europe and south into the Middle East. Archaeologists have noted that right around this time there is a sudden appearance of new agricultural practices and pottery styles in these regions. These weren't conquerors, they were climate refugees. They carried with them the trauma of their lost homeland. They told their children about the time the water rose and never stopped. Over generations, the specific details of the Bosphorus breach faded, but the core horror remained. The story evolved. The rising lake became a global flood. The survival of a few on boats became the Ark. By the time it was written down in the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Book of Genesis, it had become a story of divine judgment. But the root of the myth lies in a very real, very wet, geological catastrophe. The earthquake fish. While floods reshape the surface, there is another kind of disaster that strikes from below. One so sudden and violent that the human mind couldn't accept it was random. It needed a face. In Japan, the ground is never truly still. The archipelago sits on the Ring of Fire, the most volatile tectonic zone on the planet. Japan experiences around 1,500 earthquakes every single year. For the ancient Japanese, this constant trembling required an explanation. On November 11, 1855, the city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, was struck by a magnitude 7.0 earthquake. In mere seconds, the city was flattened. Fires erupted, consuming what the quake hadn't destroyed. Over 10,000 people died. But in the days following the disaster, as the survivors sifted through the rubble, a strange image began to flood the streets. It wasn't a picture of a demon or a dragon. It was a picture of a catfish. This is Namazu, the giant, mythical catfish who lives in the mud beneath the islands of Japan. According to Japanese folklore, Namazu is held down by a massive stone placed by the thunder god, Takamikazuchi. But the god is easily distracted, and whenever he lets his guard down, Namazu thrashes his tail and the world above shakes. It sounds like a charming fairy tale. But here is where the myth gets eerie. Why a catfish? Of all the animals in the ocean, sharks, whales, octopuses, why blame the earthquake on a bottom-dwelling fish? Because the Japanese fishermen had noticed something. Long before seismographs existed, fishermen claimed that catfish acted strangely in the hours before an earthquake. They would swarm the surface, thrashing violently, or swim in erratic patterns. They seemed to know the disaster was coming before the ground even shook. For centuries, this was dismissed as superstition. But modern biology has revealed that the myth is actually a sophisticated observation of nature. Catfish are bottom feeders. To survive in murky, dark water where eyes are useless, they have evolved supersensory organs. Their bodies are covered in taste buds and sensors that are incredibly sensitive to changes in electrical fields and pressure. We now know that before an earthquake strikes, the immense pressure building up in the tectonic plates creates a piezoelectric effect. Rocks under stress release electrical charges that travel through the ground and into the water. This changes the chemical and electrical composition of the environment. We can't feel it, but Namazu can. The catfish aren't causing the earthquake. They are reacting to the invisible precursor signals that our technology is only just beginning to understand. The thrashing that fishermen saw wasn't a monster attacking, it was a panic response to an electrical storm in the water. The people of Edo took a biological reality, the agitation of catfish before a quake, and reverse-engineered a mythology. They made the warning sign into the cause. It's a perfect example of how ancient people weren't primitive. They were observant. They saw the correlation between the fish and the tremor. They just filled in the gap with a god instead of a geologist. But sometimes the disaster is so total that there is no one left to invent a god. Sometimes the land doesn't just shake, it vanishes. And the memory of it becomes the most famous lost city in human history. The drowned world and the dying sun. What if the most famous lost civilization isn't a city of gold hidden under the ocean? What if it's a place where our ancestors actually hunted, camped, and lived? A place that drowned so slowly we almost forgot it existed until the ocean finished the job in a single day? Look at a map of Europe today. Between the United Kingdom and Denmark, there is the North Sea. It's cold, rough, and deep. But if you could rewind the clock 10,000 years, that water wouldn't be there. Instead, you would see a vast green landscape. This was Doggerland. It was a prehistoric Eden, a mesh of winding rivers, lakes, and forests that connected Britain to mainland Europe. You could walk from London to Amsterdam without getting your feet wet. It was the heart of the Mesolithic world, teeming with mammoths, deer, and human tribes. But then, the ice melted. As the planet warmed, the sea levels rose, inch by inch, year by year. For generations, the people of Doggerland retreated. They watched their hunting grounds turn into marshes, and their marshes turn into estuaries. It was a slow-motion apocalypse, but the final blow didn't come slowly. It came as a wall of water. Around 8,000 years ago, off the coast of Norway, a massive chunk of the continental shelf collapsed. This event is known as the Storegga Slide. Imagine a piece of land the size of Iceland suddenly falling into the deep ocean. The displacement of water was colossal. It triggered a tsunami that raced across the North Sea at the speed of a jet airliner. For the people clinging to the remaining low-lying islands of Doggerland, there was no warning. The wave, estimated to be up to 40 feet high in some places, swept over the land. It crashed into the coast of Scotland, penetrating 50 miles inland. When the water receded, Doggerland was effectively gone. The heart of northern Europe had been erased. Archaeologists today dredge up the remains of this lost world from the ocean floor: mammoth teeth, harpoons, and human bones. But the memory of the event likely survived in a different way. Across Britain and France, there are persistent legends of sunken kingdoms. The Welsh speak of Cantre'r Gwaelod, a fertile land lost to the sea when a gatekeeper fell asleep. In Brittany, they tell of the city of Ys, swallowed by the waves. We often assume these are variations of Plato's Atlantis. But perhaps they are older. Perhaps they are the cultural echoes of the Storegga tsunami. Stories passed down by the few who managed to run to higher ground, watching their world disappear beneath the gray waves forever. But of all the ancient apocalypses, there is one that feels most relevant to us today. Because it wasn't about the land or the sea, it was about the climate itself turning against humanity. In Norse mythology, the end of the world, Ragnarok, doesn't begin with a battle. It begins with Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter. The Eddas describe it as 3 winters in a row with no summer in between. The sun turns black, the stars vanish, the world freezes, and brothers turn against brothers in a war for survival. It sounds like high fantasy. But historians now know that Fimbulwinter was a real year. The year was 536 AD. And according to medieval historians, it was the worst year to be alive in human history. A Byzantine historian, Procopius, wrote, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year." In China, chronicles recorded snow falling in August. In Ireland, the bread failed. The entire northern hemisphere was plunged into a sudden, deep freeze. Crops failed globally. Famine followed. And then, taking advantage of the weakened population, the first bubonic plague arrived. For the Vikings living in Scandinavia, this wasn't just bad weather. It was the death of the gods. The sun, the giver of life, had failed. They didn't know why, but we do. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica have revealed that in early 536 AD, a massive volcanic eruption occurred. likely in Iceland or possibly Ilopango in El Salvador. The explosion was so violent it ejected millions of tons of sulfur and ash into the stratosphere. This veil of ash blanketed the world, reflecting the sunlight back into space and dropping global temperatures by up to 2.5 degrees Celsius. It was a volcanic winter that lasted for years. Imagine being a Norse farmer in the 6th century. You don't know what a volcano is, you don't understand atmospheric physics. All you know is that the summer didn't come. The sun is pale and cold. Your children are starving. The wolves are coming closer to the village. You would conclude that the end of the world has begun. Archaeology in Sweden confirms the horror. From this period, we find hoards of gold buried in the ground, desperate sacrifices offered to gods who were no longer listening. We find villages abandoned and reclaimed by the forest. The myth of Ragnarok, of the sun being swallowed by a wolf and the world freezing over, is likely the traumatized memory of the year the sky went dark. It is a story of climate collapse, remembered as a war of the gods. When we look at these stories, Sodom, the flood, Namazu, Doggerland, Ragnarok, it is easy to dismiss them as ancient superstitions. We like to think we are smarter now. We have satellites, seismographs, and climate models. But we are missing the point. These myths weren't written to entertain us. They were written to warn us. The people who told these stories were the survivors. They were the ones who stood on the hill when the asteroid hit the valley. They were the ones who ran to the mountains when the dam broke. They were the ones who endured the winter that never ended. They took the most terrifying moments of their lives and encoded them into the only enduring storage medium they had, story. They wanted us to know that the Earth is not a static stage. It is a living, violent, and unpredictable beast. They wanted us to know that civilization is fragile, that a city can turn to glass in a second, that a coastline can vanish in a day, that the sun can be taken away. The wrath of God was their way of explaining forces they couldn't control. Today we call it astrophysics, geology, and climate science. The names have changed, but the reality remains the same. We are walking on a planet that has reset itself before, and the evidence suggests it will do it again. The question isn't whether these ancient apocalypses actually happened. We know they did. The question is, when the next one arrives, will we be able to read the warning signs in time? If you just felt a shiver down your spine realizing how close we are to the edge, then you need to hit that subscribe button right now, because here is the thing. History doesn't just repeat itself, it rhymes. And most of us are walking around completely blind to the cycles that govern our planet. This video is just the beginning. Next week, I am diving deep into an even bigger mystery, a lost technology that shouldn't have existed 10,000 years ago, and the shocking evidence that suggests we might be a species with amnesia. I've spent months researching this, and what I've found is going to completely flip your understanding of human history. You do not want to miss it. So click subscribe, turn on that notification bell, and join the community. Let's uncover the truth together. I'll see you in the next one.